In the meantime, it may feel like there's not a whole lot of urgency in addressing the big question that is clearly facing the Democratic Party, which is how do they rebuild and fight on from here? Because on the surface, it looks a little bit like not a ton is going on. But there are some indications that change is happening. They're important. So take Congress. The Democratic caucus is doing something they rarely do, particularly on this scale. What's happening is younger members on some of the House's most influential committees are challenging older senior committee leaders for their jobs. This week, Congressman Jamie Raskin announced that he would challenge the ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler. And just 2 days later, in a letter to Democratic colleagues, Nadler threw his support behind Raskin's bid. With Congressman Raskin now expected to be the ranking member on Judiciary, that has left an opening for Democratic leadership on the Oversight Committee. 74-year-old Virginia Congressman Jerry Conley has announced he will seek the position, but he's going to face some stiff competition from 35-year-old New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. In a letter announcing her bid on Friday, the Congresswoman wrote, quote, "This is not a position I seek lightly. Now more than ever, we must focus on the committee's strong history of both holding administrations accountable and taking on the economic precarity and inequality that is challenging the American way of life." Now, in addition to those two powerful committees, similar shakeups seem to be brewing in both the Natural Resources and Agricultural committees. Democrats in the coming weeks will vote on who should lead committees for the party, and all the ones I mentioned. And all of that could determine who the most prominent voices will be as people are speaking out in the new Trump Republican-controlled era. Now, something like committee leadership might sound like a small inside Washington thing you may not care about, but it does mark a notable shift in a party that has for a long time deferred almost entirely to the seniority and sometimes age of their members, people who have been there longer. As retiring New Hampshire Congresswoman Annie Kuster said, "I think we as Democrats could do a better job with elevating some of our younger members who have great experience, and you should not have to be in Congress for 30 years before you can have a meaningful role in leadership and policy." She's not wrong. That makes complete common sense. And particularly at this moment, more of the same from the Democratic Party is simply not going to work. Change needs to happen. New blood is good. Now, the debate over what the change should be isn't only happening among Democrats on Capitol Hill. That's one of the places. Right now, when we've talked to a number of these candidates over the last couple of weeks, there are a number of people stepping in to vie for the chair of the Democratic National Committee. And while their visions may differ, they have different backgrounds, different things to say, there is one line that is constant, which is basically that business as usual is not going to cut it.
We need to train and equip and deploy and resource communicators to go across the country onto more hostile terrain. And we need to go to places where people are not tuning in to political news at all.
We need to go where people are at and where they're getting their information. And we have to be much more sophisticated in how we do that.
We have to ask ourselves a lot of questions about how it is that we have a brand that people run away from instead of a brand that people want to run on. Yeah. And so, you know, it's a time for rebuilding and it's a time for reconnecting.
Up next, I'm going to talk to another one of the people running to be the next chair of the DNC, New York State Senator James Skoufis. The race to be the next DNC chair is definitely getting crowded. And while there are some very familiar faces in the mix, there are some you may still be getting to know, like our next guest, New York State Senator James Skoufis, who made a name for himself by winning in a district Trump won pretty handily. He's kind of an underdog. He probably would say that too, but that's precisely how he's pitching himself.
Some of you may be skeptical. I'm not a DC insider or come from machine politics. The Republicans I beat time after time were also skeptical. But we outworked them, outraised them, outmessaged them, outorganized them every time. Let's build a better Democratic Party together.
State Senator James Skoufis joins me now. It's great to see you. Let me just start by asking you about something you said in your announcement. You said Democrats need to abandon the Beltway playbook, which sounds very good. But what do you mean by that? What's the Beltway playbook? What exactly do you want to completely get rid of?
First, thanks for having me, Jen. And you had just said a few moments ago that change is good and that new blood is good. And that's exactly why I'm running. I'm not an operative. I'm not a state party chair, although I have great respect for them. We've tried many of these approaches over and over again, and here we are. So, yes, I'm the outsider candidate who wants to throw away the stale tactics, the old playbook. I know how to win in a deep Trump district, as you just mentioned. And so what are the Beltway sort of tactics that you're asking about? For example, we have millions and millions of dollars spent on D.C. consultants that we may as well be burning that money and throwing it out the window. I just spoke with a DNC member in Arizona who told me, battleground state obviously, who got 16 glossy mailers a day from the National Democratic Party. I don't know about you, but there's nothing that the 15th mailer is not doing that the 16th mailer is doing. We should
Fair.
be reorienting that money to the folks on the ground, our committees, our friends in organized labor.
You also said, which is a different message than I've heard from others, that we need to move on from the era of hair on fire, texts and emails, to inclusive, empowering communication that builds relationship, not opt-outs and unsubscribes, which does, I think, sound good to a lot of people. What the other challenge, though, that Democrats have right now is keeping people inspired and engaged, given how much Republicans just won. So how are you proposing to do that while also kind of maintaining a very inclusive, broad message?
So instead of sending those 600, 700 text messages leading up to the election that you and I and most Democrats got that were highly ineffective, quite frankly, they were borderline harassing, we should be sending the millions of dollars instead to folks on the ground who can provide for human-to-human contact. One of our major problems is that we've stopped becoming a national party within the big Democratic tent. We've stopped showing up in some places, quite frankly, like mine. It's not too long ago that we had U.S. senators in the Great Plains, in some cases 2 U.S. senators in states like the Dakotas and Iowa. And quite frankly, we've lost in those places. We've lost traditionally in communities like mine because we've stopped showing up. We've stopped going on media outlets that are traditionally uncomfortable or unfriendly for Democrats. I embrace those opportunities. If I didn't, I would have lost by 15 points 4 weeks ago. And so the next DNC chair has to be showing up himself or herself and deploying our resources in a manner that we begin reinvesting in communities beyond the 7 battleground states, beyond the traditional places that we send hundreds of millions, over $1 billion to this past cycle, and begin rebuilding our bench, begin reactivating that DNA that is deep, deep down inside some people who used to vote Democratic but have stopped, in large part because we've stopped talking to them.
We only have about 30 seconds left, but one of the questions on everybody's minds is the primary calendar. Would you want to change the primary calendar from what it was changed to the last time around?
So I'm the only candidate running for chair who will actually answer this question. Whether people like it or not, the change was made, and I think that South Carolina deserves a crack at a competitive primary, and then we can reevaluate. Dean Phillips versus Joe Biden was not a competitive contest, so let's see how they do. Let's see how the current order does, and then we can revisit it. But my main point here is that we need a DNC chair who's willing to have the difficult conversation like this one, who's willing to answer these challenging questions. And that's certainly what I'll lean into as the next DNC chair.
I think it's time for everybody just to start to tell people what they think. That's my view. New York State Senator James Skoufis, thank you so much for joining. We're going to be back after a quick break.